I was wiping down the bar, same as every night, when the door swung open and everything changed. At first, I didn't even recognize her. She moved so quietly, slipping inside like she didn't want anyone to notice. But the second she lifted her head, I knew. Everyone did. The room stiffened, forks pausing midway to mouths, whispers crawling through the air like a slow-moving storm. Melania Trump had just walked into our restaurant. John, our manager, was standing near the hostess stand, watching everything with narrowed eyes. His whole body tensed. "No way," he muttered under his breath. I wiped my hands on my apron. "What?" His voice was sharp. "She shouldn't be here." I stared at him. "She's just getting dinner, John." But he was already moving. The way he walked, fast, controlled, his hands balled into fists, sent a chill through me. Something about it felt personal, but I didn't know why. Before I could stop him, he was standing right in front of her, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Trump, I need to ask you to leave." The room fell into dead silence. Melania blinked. At first, she didn't react. She just stood there in that elegant coat, one hand resting gently on her purse, like she hadn't quite processed the words. Then, slowly, her eyes met his. "Excuse me." Her voice was calm, but something flickered beneath it, something I couldn't quite place. John's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you to leave." A man in a suit, standing behind her, took a step forward. Secret Service, obviously. His hand hovered near his waist, his expression unreadable. I could feel the entire restaurant holding its breath. Melania didn't move. "May I ask why?" John exhaled sharply, glancing around. Customers were watching, some pulling out their phones. A group near the window was already recording. I saw John's throat bob, like he was swallowing something bitter. "We reserve the right to refuse service," he said. Melania nodded just once. Her face didn't change, but I saw something shift in her eyes. A flicker of disappointment, or maybe understanding. Slowly, she reached up and adjusted the collar of her coat. Then she turned without another word. But before she could take a step, an older woman near the front spoke. "That's not right," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't have to agree with her, but you can't just throw her out like that." John didn't look at the woman. His eyes stayed on Melania. "I can," he said. Another voice, this time a younger man from the bar. "That's crazy, man." Melania raised a hand, silencing them. Then she looked at John again, really looked at him. Her expression was unreadable. Then, just as quietly as she came in, she turned and walked toward the door. And that's when the shouting started. The shouting started before the door even closed behind her. At first, it was just murmurs, a few hushed voices blending together, but then someone near the bar stood up and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you serious? You just kicked out Melania Trump." John didn't turn around. He just stood there, watching the door like he was expecting her to come back. The older woman who had spoken earlier shook her head, pushing back from her table. "That was disgusting," she said. "I've been coming here for years. I won't be back." She grabbed her purse and walked out. That's when others started following her lead. A man in a suit, two younger women near the window, a family sitting by the fireplace. One by one, they got up and left, some shaking their heads, others glaring at John as they passed. "Wow," one of the waiters whispered behind me. "This is bad." It got worse. A man at the bar, phone in hand, waved at John. "You're blowing up online, man." Someone filmed the whole thing. John turned then, his face finally showing something other than that blank, unreadable stare. "What?" The guy smirked, tapping his screen. "It's everywhere." I reached for my own phone, my heart pounding, and pulled up the first social media app one could think of. It took less than a second. The video was already viral. There was John, standing firm, telling her to leave. There was Melania, quiet, unreadable. There were the voices in the background, the gasps, the stunned silence. The captions were brutal. "Restaurant manager refuses to serve Melania Trump." Disgusting behavior from a business owner. Kicking her out? Absolutely disgraceful. And others saying the opposite. Finally, someone stands up to her. Brave manager takes a stand. She deserves it. Comments flooded in, each more intense than the last. People were arguing, calling each other names, making threats. Some were defending John. Others were demanding he be fired. I looked up at him. His hands were gripping the edge of the hostess stand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "We should take the video down," I said. John let out a short, bitter laugh. Too late. He was right. It had already spread. There was no stopping it now. The front doors burst open, and a man with a camera rushed in, nearly knocking over a server. A woman followed, holding a microphone. "John Miller," she called out. "I'm with Channel 5 News. Do you have a comment on what happened here tonight?" John stiffened. No comment. The camera light flicked on, the lens aimed right at him. "Do you regret kicking out Melania Trump?" Another voice, this time from outside. "John, over here." More reporters were crowding near the windows, their cameras pressed against the glass. One of the waiters backed up, looking panicked. "What is happening?" The phone at the hostess stand rang. Then another. Then another. John reached for one, his fingers twitching slightly as he pressed it to his ear. "Hello." A pause. Then his face changed. He swallowed hard, his throat moving. I understand." His voice was quieter now. I moved closer. "Who was that?" John didn't answer right away. He set the phone down carefully, like it might explode. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since all of this started, I saw something close to fear in his eyes. "That was the Secret Service," he said. "They're coming." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The words just hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. The Secret Service. They were coming. John's face had gone pale. He let go of the phone like it had burned him. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at the front door like something was about to crash through it. I swallowed hard. Did they say why? John blinked, then shook his head. Just that they needed to speak with me. His voice was quiet, almost like he didn't believe it himself. The rest of the staff looked just as shaken. One of the servers, a younger guy named Kevin, took a step back. Are they going to arrest you or something?" John exhaled, pressing a hand to his forehead. "I don't know." The hostess' phone rang again. Then another one behind the bar. The sound of it made my skin crawl. The restaurant was still half full, but nobody was eating anymore. They were all watching us, watching John. Some of them were still filming. Then the front door opened. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. They didn't have guns drawn or anything dramatic like in the movies, but the energy in the room changed instantly. One of them, taller than the other, scanned the restaurant before locking eyes with John. "John Miller." John straightened, but didn't answer right away. He glanced at me, then back at the man. "Yeah." The taller agent nodded. "We need to speak with you. Privately." A shiver ran down my spine. The way he said it, low, firm, final, it wasn't a request. John hesitated, then cleared his throat. Can we talk here?" The second agent, shorter but just as intimidating, shook his head. "Not here." John glanced at the staff. I could see his mind racing. If he left with them, what would that mean? Was he in trouble? Was this bigger than just kicking someone out of a restaurant? The taller agent took a step forward. "We need you to come with us now." John let out a slow breath. "Fine." He looked at me. "You're in charge till I get back." The words made my stomach drop. He didn't even know if he was coming back. He took off his apron, sat on the counter, and followed them toward the door. The entire restaurant watched in silence as they stepped outside. The door shut behind them, and just like that, John was gone. The moment he left, everyone started talking at once. The reporters outside swarmed the front window, trying to see where he was going. Kevin turned to me, wide-eyed. "What do we do now?" I had no idea. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and checked the news. The story had already spread. Some headlines called John a hero. Others said he was a coward. But one headline stood out more than the rest. Melania Trump requests private meeting with restaurant manager. My blood ran cold. What did she want with him? John was gone, taken by the Secret Service, and nobody knew why. I stood behind the bar, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my fingers ached. The whole restaurant felt different now, quieter, heavier. Customers were still there, but nobody was eating. They were whispering, checking their phones, waiting for something else to happen. Kevin leaned in next to me. "Should we close up?" I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. "Let's just wait." I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through the endless stream of news articles and videos. And then I saw it. The headline. The one that made my stomach drop. Melania Trump requests private meeting with restaurant manager. My pulse pounded in my ears. I read it again, then again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But no, it was everywhere. News sites, social media, even TV headlines flashing across the restaurant's mounted screens. John hadn't just been taken for questioning. He had been taken to her. I tried to picture it. The car ride. The silence. John sitting stiffly between two agents, staring out the window, knowing he was about to face the woman he had just thrown out of his restaurant. But why? What could she possibly want from him? I stared at the front door, half expecting him to walk back and like nothing happened. But he didn't. Minutes turned to an hour. The restaurant was almost empty now, only a few customers lingering, waiting for more drama. Staff members were whispering in the corner, but no one had any answers. Then, finally my phone buzzed. A text from John. "I'm coming back." That was all it said. My breath caught in my throat. I typed back, "Are you okay?" No answer. I felt sick. 15 minutes later, the front door opened, and John walked in. Alone. He looked different. His face was pale, his eyes distant. He didn't say a word as he stepped inside. His hand was shaking just slightly. The staff froze. Everyone was watching him, waiting for him to explain, but he didn't. He just walked straight past us and into his office, shutting the door behind him. A thick silence filled the room. Kevin looked at me. What just happened? I didn't know, but I was going to find out. I took a deep breath and walked to the office. My hand hovered over the doorknob. For the first time, I wondered if I really wanted to know the answer. Then I pushed the door open. John was sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. What happened? I asked. He didn't look at me. His fingers tapped against the desk. A slow, nervous rhythm. "She forgave me," he said. His voice was hollow, like he barely believed it himself. I frowned. "That's it." He swallowed hard. "No." I stepped closer. "Then what?" John finally turned to me, and in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Not anger, not guilt, fear. "She knew something," he whispered. "Something about me." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" John didn't answer. He just looked past me, lost in thought. And for the first time since I had known him, I saw real fear in his eyes. John sat there, frozen, staring past me like I wasn't even in the room. His fingers drummed against the desk, tap, 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 like he was thinking too fast to form words. I stepped closer. "John." "Nothing." I pulled up a chair, sitting across from him. "What did she say?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. He finally met my eyes. "She knew my name." I frowned. "Of course she did. Everyone knows your name now." "No," he whispered. "Not like that." A chill ran down my back. "She said my full name," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan Miller. Middle name Thomas." Like she had known it for years. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I never told anyone my middle name. It's not online. It's not on my work documents." But she knew. I felt my stomach tighten. "That doesn't mean anything. She's got people who could find that." John let out a breath. "That's not all." I stayed quiet. "She said," he hesitated, his fingers gripping the desk. "She said she remembered me." I stared at him. "Remembered you?" John nodded slowly. His face was pale, like the words themselves had drained the life out of him. "She said I helped her once. A long time ago." He let out a hollow laugh. "But that's impossible." The air in the office felt heavy. "When?" I asked. John shook his head. "That's the thing. She said it was when she was a kid. Back in Slovenia." His voice cracked slightly. "I've never been to Slovenia." Goosebumps prickle my skin. "She said there was a man, a young American, who helped her family when they were struggling. She remembered his face. My face." I tried to process it. "John," I said carefully, "that doesn't make sense." He ran a hand through his hair, looking like he was barely holding it together. "I know." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the one question I wasn't sure I wanted the answer to. "Do you think she's right?" John's breathing was uneven. "I don't know. I don't remember." He looked at me, desperate, like he wanted me to have an answer he couldn't find. "But she did." I tried to think rationally, but nothing about this was rational. "How did the meeting end?" John exhaled sharply. "She just looked at me and said she wasn't mad, that she understood why I did what I did. Then she said she hoped I'd remember someday." His voice dropped lower, and then she left. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Nothing about this made sense. But John wasn't lying. I could see it in his face, and that scared me even more. John sat there, gripping the edge of the desk like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His face was pale, his breath shallow. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. Melania Trump had claimed to know him, not just from the news, not from this restaurant incident, from before, for her childhood. But that was impossible. I swallowed hard. John, you're sure she wasn't messing with you? He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I never had before. Doubt, fear, something deeper. I don't know, he whispered. But she wasn't joking. She looked at me like she really knew me. The room felt too small. I could hear the hum of the restaurant outside, customers murmuring, but it felt distant, like another world. In here was just John, his words, and the impossible weight of them. I exhaled slowly. Okay, let's think about this logically. John gave a bitter laugh. Logically, he shook his head. Nothing about this is logical. Maybe she got you mixed up with someone else. His fingers tapped against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. He shook his head. No, she was sure. He swallowed hard. And that's not all. I stiffened. What else? John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He set on the desk between us. I stared at it. What's that? She gave it to me before she left. My fingers felt cold as I reached for it. Slowly, I unfolded it. Inside was a photograph. I felt the breath leave my body. It was old, faded at the edges, the colors slightly washed out. In it, a young boy, maybe 10 or 11, stood next to a girl. The girl was unmistakably her, Melania, much younger, her features softer but still recognizable. But the boy, I stared at him, my heart hammering. He looked exactly like John. Same sharp jawline, same dark hair, same piercing eyes. It was impossible, completely impossible. I lifted my gaze to John. He was already watching me, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. That's not me, he said, his voice shaking. It can't be, but I couldn't look away from the photo. The boy was him. Every part of me knew it. And yet, John had never been to Slovenia. He had never met Melania as a child. I set the photo down carefully, my fingers trembling. John, I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. What if you just don't remember? His breath caught. For the first time, I saw something shift in his expression. A flicker of something buried deep, something he didn't want to think about. But I knew in that moment that this wasn't just a mistake. This was something bigger. And whatever it was, John was about to find out the truth. John stared at the photograph like it was something dangerous, something that might explode if he looked at it too long. His breathing had changed, slower, more careful. I could feel the tension coming off him, like his whole body was fighting against something his mind didn't want to admit. That's not me, he said again, but this time he didn't sound so sure. I swallowed hard. John, what if it is? He shook his head, laughing, but there was no humor in it. I've never been to Slovenia. I've never even left the country. He ran a hand through his hair. This doesn't make any sense. I kept my voice steady. Maybe it's something you don't remember. John shot me a look. How could I forget something like this? I didn't have an answer. He pushed the photo away like he couldn't stand to look at it anymore. His fingers drummed against the desk again. Tap, tap, tap. I had never seen him like this before. For the first time, he looked lost. I leaned forward. John, what if? The office phone rang, cutting me off. We both jumped. John hesitated, staring at it like he was afraid to answer. Then, slowly, he picked it up. Hello. Silence. His grip tightened. Who is this? I watched as his face changed. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened. He listened, his body going completely still. Then he hung up. I barely breathed. John. He didn't look at me right away. When he did, something in his expression had shifted. That was her. I felt my stomach drop. Melania? He nodded. What did she say? John swallowed. His voice was quiet when he spoke. She said she was sorry. I blinked. For what? He let out a slow, shaky breath. For making me remember. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what was more terrifying. The fact that Melania Trump believed she knew John from her childhood, or the fact that John was starting to believe it too. The silence between us was deafening. John sat there, the phone still clutched in his hand like he didn't know what to do with it. His eyes were distant, like he was somewhere far away, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was thinking about what Melania had said. Sorry. Sorry for making me remember. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it was some kind of apology or a warning. But the weight of it was heavy. John, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He blinked, then looked at me like he had just come back to the room. Sorry, I don't know what to think anymore. His voice was hoarse. I could feel the unease in the air, thick and suffocating. What did you tell her? He looked down at his hands, like he was ashamed to answer. I told her I didn't remember her. I told her I didn't remember anything from back then. But what if she's right? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. What if you really did know her? He ran a hand through his hair. I could see the frustration building inside him. I don't know, okay? I don't know what's real anymore. I don't even know who I am anymore. His voice cracked. I moved closer to him. John, listen. You don't have to remember everything right away. You don't have to figure it all out at once. But you can't let this, whatever this is, control you. He looked up at me, his eyes full of doubt. But what if she's telling the truth? I didn't have an answer. How could I? But I could see the pain in his eyes, the conflict he was going through. It wasn't just about a photo anymore. It was about something deeper. Something John was fighting, something he didn't want to face. I sat down next to him. You don't have to do this alone, okay? I'm here. He nodded slowly, but it was clear that he didn't believe me. He still had doubts. But I couldn't leave him like this. I couldn't let him go down this path alone. I've been thinking, he said suddenly, his voice quieter now. What if I did know her back then? I turned to him. John, what do you mean? He took a deep breath. What if there's a part of me, somewhere deep inside, that remembers? What if I blocked it out for some reason? I was silent for a moment. Maybe. I don't know. But what matters is what you do now. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something. What do you mean? I mean, you don't have to let this define you. Whatever happened in the past, whatever Melania says, it doesn't have to control your future. John seemed to think about that for a long time, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he spoke. I'm scared. I know, I said softly. But you can face it. You can face whatever's coming. There was a long pause, and I wasn't sure what he was going to say next. Then, slowly, he nodded. Maybe I could try to remember. But I won't let it ruin my life. I won't let it tear me apart. I smiled, relief washing over me. That's all I'm asking. Just take it one step at a time. John stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city. I could see the change in him, the shift in his posture. He was starting to come to terms with what was happening. I'm going to call her, he said suddenly, his voice steady. I froze. What? Are you sure? John turned to me, his expression firm. I have to know. I need to hear it from her, straight from her mouth. I hesitated. Are you ready for that? He nodded. I think I have to be. I watched as he picked up the phone again, his hands no longer shaking. He dialed the number. My heart pounded as the phone rang. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Melania picked up. Hello. Her voice was cool, controlled. John's voice was calm, but I could tell he was still struggling. Melania, it's John. We need to talk. There was a pause. Then, she spoke again. I thought you might call. I need to know the truth, John said, his words deliberate. I need to know what happened back then. What you remember. There was a long silence. I could almost hear Melania thinking, deciding how to respond. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer this time. I've been waiting for you to remember, John. I never wanted to push you, but I knew it would come back to you eventually. John closed his eyes, like the weight of her words was pressing down on him. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I don't know what's real. I know, she said quietly, but I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm not trying to confuse you. I just want you to know the truth. John's jaw clenched. And what's the truth, Melania? For a moment, there was silence. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth is, you were there. You helped my family when we needed it most. I'll never forget what you did for us. John stood still, his grip tightening on the phone. But I don't remember that. I don't remember anything about that time. I know you don't, she said. But I never forgot. And I've been waiting for you to remember. John was silent for a long time, staring out the window. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "I don't know if I can." "You don't have to remember it all at once," she said gently. "But just know that I've always been grateful for what you did." John's eyes softened. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just take your time. When you're ready, you'll remember." John hung up the phone without another word. He turned to me, his expression still uncertain but somehow lighter. "I don't know what happens next," he said, "but maybe I can figure it out." I smiled, stepping closer to him. "You will, one step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, John seemed to believe